For many people, 2025 is a year of worrying uncertainty, with inter-capitalist rivalry provoking trade wars and actual wars, and oppression, poverty, and the threats of both climate catastrophe and right-wing populism all on the rise. And with former workers' parties, like the Labour Party in Britain, having long since abandoned even any pretence of socialist ideology, workers and youth looking for answers to this capitalist chaos can find them hard to find. But one place to look, especially for those of us in Britain, and, as I'll explain, for workers in the USA too, confronted with the Trump presidency, is this short book that Leon Trotsky, one of the key leaders of the 1917 Russian Revolution, wrote 100 years ago, called Where is Britain Going? Now, that's not to say, of course, that a now century-old book can provide instant magic answers. 1925 was not 2025. Then, for one, the Russian Revolution still offered fresh hope to millions worldwide. The Stalinist counter-revolution in the Soviet Union was only just beginning to take hold. Sadly, by the 1990s, that bureaucratic degeneration eventually led to capitalist restoration of these previously nationalised, although far from genuinely socialist, economies. With capitalism appearing to be unchallenged as the only way to run the world, the leaders of former workers' parties like Tony Blair in Britain rocketed to the right and socialist consciousness was thrown backwards. And that damage has still not been completely overcome. Contrast that to 1925, when even the right-wing labour and trade union leaders had to refer, at least in words, to the need for socialism. And Clause 4, printed on every Labour Party membership card, stated that the party's aim was the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. Sadly, however, workers had already by then had the experience of the first ever Labour government in 1924, and of those fine words not being matched by actions once Labour were in power. Now, certainly, amongst important layers of British workers and the left wing of its political and trade union leadership, socialist ideas were far more boldly expressed then than now, although, as Trotsky warns, they were often expressed in a confused and contradictory way that needed to be challenged and exposed, especially by the newly formed Communist Party in Britain. Now, sadly, Trotsky's warnings against a policy of just cuddling up to those trade union left leaders without also being firm in criticism of their weaknesses when necessary, they were left unheeded. Instead, the British CP, under the influence of the Stalinists, adopted an increasingly opportunist and uncritical approach. That left the best trade union fighters completely unprepared for the inevitable retreats that these woolly lefts made during and after the general strike that took place just a year later in May 1926, and indeed was one of the factors that led to its defeat. And that's important advice that still holds true 100 years later, especially when some parties on the left are happy to give platforms to some of today's left celebrities without also being firm in their criticisms of these lefts, with their often unclear and inconsistent ideas about what needs to be done. Yes, obviously, we need to engage in a friendly way with left trade union leaders and politicians, but not uncritically. It's important to make clear demands on them about how they should use their positions to build both trade union and community struggles, and also urgently to build a new mass workers' party. Now, while there are important differences, there are also some striking similarities between 1925 when Trotsky was writing and now, not least the inter-capitalist global rivalry that was accelerating then after World War I. Back then, like today in 2025, a previously dominant capitalist power was being threatened by new competitors. Except while now it's the USA coming under threat from other trading blocs, not least from the strength of Chinese manufacturing. In 1925, it was Britain, faced first with the threat of German industry, a threat which had led to World War I in the first place, and then the post-First World War strength of the US economy. In 2025, it's the threat of China's challenge to previous US domination that lies behind the protectionist move by Trump, and for example the jettisoning of Zelensky to cozy up to Putin instead. Then, as now, the vital development that could take place on the basis of a global plan in the common interests of the workers of the world and its environment is being blocked by capitalism's need to pursue private profit and increasingly by these barriers erected by competing capitalist nation states. But we've got to take confidence that there is another side to the coin to the fear, division and insecurity created by Trump, Musk and their ilk. And that is it will also provoke a reaction, not just from those immediately under threat, but also from US workers themselves, once Trump's promises of better living standards turned out to be completely empty. And in the preface to the American edition of Where is Britain Going?, Trotsky writes a few words of encouragement that still ring true for us 100 years later. He wrote, "For all its might, American capitalism is not a self-sufficient whole, but a part of the world's economy. While driving Europe more and more into a blind alley, American capital is preparing wars and revolutionary upheavals which will then strike back at the economy of the United States with a terrible rebound. The magnates of the American trusts, the oil tycoons and exporters, the billionaires of New York, Chicago and San Francisco are irreversibly, if unconsciously, fulfilling their revolutionary function. And the American proletariat, the US working class, will ultimately fulfill theirs." Now, people of my generation, brought up in the post-World War II boom, are coming to realise that we weren't living in a normal phase of capitalist development. No, that was the exception. During that period, world trade expanded massively, at the expense of the colonial world, of course, and the profits generated meant that major capitalist powers could afford to grant concessions to hold back the threat from their own labour movements. But this was also forced on the capitalist powers by the threat of their common enemy, the planned economies of the Stalinist bloc, which had emerged strengthened from World War II, however distorted by the undemocratic, bureaucratic rule which eventually led to their downfall. Now, of course, all those gains, like here in Britain, the National Health Service, council services and homes, free education, decent pensions, and so on, are all under threat. It's not by accident that Starmer joked with Trump that while a chainsaw wasn't quite his style, New Labour too were cutting red tape and bureaucracy and were open for business. We know what that means. Starmer's government is also planning a new wave of cuts to public services, on the grounds, of course, that there is no money, except, of course, there is when it comes to weapons for war. But the world known by the generation that grew up following the collapse of Stalinism in the 1990s can now also be seen to be only a very brief period of capitalist triumphalism. For a decade or so, the US seemed to be the only dominant power in a unipolar world. But that period has now been decisively replaced by today's unstable multipolar world of competing and fluctuating capitalist trading blocs. Instead of globalization, each nation state now fighting it out for itself. But the US capitalists are going to face exactly the same splits that took hold of the British ruling class at the end of the 19th century. Splits that Trotsky discusses in the first chapter of his book. He explains that dominant British capitalism had adopted free trade as its guiding principle. That was the watchword of the Liberal Party in its prime. And that was in order to prevent any barriers to further exploitation and the ability of British manufacturing, trading and financial might to amass private profit. And again, the wealth generated by a global empire had allowed it to grant reforms to stave off some opposition at home, like extending voting and trade union rights, increased wages, reforms of course firmly denied to those living in its colonial conquests, whether in India or Ireland, South Africa or the Middle East. But then, faced with new competition from rivals like Germany, who had invested in superior technique and industrial organisation, a protectionist trend emerged amongst the British ruling class. You'll see the similarities, just as it has now in the US around Trump. The Liberals declined, to be replaced by the Conservatives as the main party of British imperialism. Now, in turn, that opened the door to the growth of the Labour Party, as workers and their trade unions, instead of hanging on to the coattails of the Liberal Party, set about building their own working class representation instead. That, of course, is the history that we now need to repeat once more, to break the unions from what is now an entirely pro-capitalist Labour Party. And here's another Trotsky quote from 1925 that is also relevant today. He explains that how before, by rocking the parliamentary swing from right to left and from left to right, the bourgeoisie found a vent for the opposition feelings of the working masses. In 1925, that swing was between the Tories and Liberals. In 2025, it's between Tories and Labour. But then, as now, the lack of any firm social base for these capitalist parties opened a vacuum to be filled by new forces. Yes, there is the threat of that vacuum being filled from the populist right, like reform, but as long as the opportunity is taken, certainly from the left by the workers' movement as it was in 1920s. And Trotsky explains how after a massive strike wave immediately following the First World War had been defeated, paralysed in the sphere of economic action, the energy of the masses was directed onto the political plane. The Labour Party grew as if out of the earth itself. And in the present situation in Britain, such a new mass party can grow quickly again. Now, the fact that today, like then, the main parties lacked any firm social base stems from the fact that ailing capitalism, the system which Labour and Tory and Liberals represent, and Reform as well, is no longer able to deliver even mild reforms for working people, only cuts and attacks on living standards. And if British capitalism was being elbowed out by other capitalist powers in 1925, by 2025, its decline is even greater, its ability to withstand capitalist crisis even less. Rather than invest to compete with its new rivals, the British capitalists, perhaps more than any other globally, turned instead to the short-term gains of speculation on the money markets, leaving it now even more vulnerable at a time of trade wars. But we also have to explain that solutions to this crisis are not a return to free trade globalising capitalism, nor its protectionist trade war version. The only solution is through collective ownership and a democratic socialist plan of the world's economy. That's a conclusion that the world's working class and poor now need to reach and act upon. And it's for its leading layers, those coming together even for now in small numbers, in parties like ours, the Socialist Party, who need to assist them in doing so. Now, of course, the Labour Party, was always a living contradiction. It was a capitalist workers' party, with leaders wedded to capitalism, as that first 1924 government and many others had shown, but with democratic structures that allowed the working class to press that party to act in its interests from below. But 100 years on, those structures no longer exist. And the avenues that even allowed Jeremy Corbyn to become its leader have been firmly shut off. Starmer's Labour Party is an openly pro-capitalist party, even though some memories of the role that it once played are still clung onto by trade union leaders who instead should be building a new party to provide workers with their own representation and organisation. Now, some of the specific labour and trade union leaders that Trotsky comments on in this book might now be long forgotten. There's nevertheless lots to pick up on from reading it for yourself. I just want to highlight a few of those points. Trotsky warns how throughout the whole history of the British labour movement there has been pressure by the capitalists upon the working class through the agency of intellectuals and drawing room socialists who reject the class struggle and preach collaboration with the bosses. But he adds that those British labour organisations that are the most unalloyed, the most solid in class composition, namely the trade unions, have lifted the Labour Party directly upon their own shoulders. The working class needs a class party. It is striving by every means to create it. It puts pressure on the trade unions. It pays political levies. But this mounting pressure from below, from the plants and the factories, from the docks and the mines, is opposed by a counter pressure from above, from the sphere of official British politics. And that's worth thinking about in our own struggle to build a new mass workers' party. Those pressures from below and from above will continue to apply. As Trotsky noted back in 1925, the working class will in all probability have to renew its leadership several times before it creates a party really answering the historical situation and the tasks of the British working class. Trotsky also has plenty to say in answer to those who claimed then, as we also hear now, that British workers won't ever be ready for socialist change, and that reforms can only ever be secured in Britain a little by little at a time, leaving fundamental socialist change, revolutionary change if you like, as some distant aspiration. Trotsky points out that similar things were said about the supposedly submissive massives of Russia, but how their outlook had been transformed by events to one of criticism, initiative and collective creativity. Now he acknowledges the differences, that the sudden development of a fresh Russian working class, taken from the village to the modern factories of Moscow and Petrograd, and the lack also of any, if you like, parliamentary tradition, had made it easier for those masses to overthrow capitalist rule in Russia in 1917. But Trotsky points out that the flip side of this economic and cultural backwardness was it then made it harder to build a socialist economy after the revolution. And indeed, as Trotsky explained in detail elsewhere, it was essentially that isolation of economically weak Russia that led to the Stalinist counter-revolution. But Trotsky explains that in contrast, the richer and more cultured a country, and the older its parliamentary democratic tradition, like Britain, the harder it is for a party, a communist party, to take power. But the faster and the more successfully will the work of socialist construction proceed after the conquest of power. Put more concretely, the overturn of the British bourgeoisie is no easy task. It does require a necessary gradualness, that is, serious preparation. But once having taken control of state power, the land, the industrial, commercial and banking apparatus, the proletariat, the working class of Britain, will be able to carry out the reorganisation of the capitalist economy into a socialist one with far less sacrifices, far more successes, and at a much quicker pace. And they're useful words for today. Where is Britain going also provides numerous reminders of the concealed revolutionary history of Britain, not least the English Revolution of the 17th century, that under Cromwell's dictatorship provided the political foundation for the development of British capitalism. Even though its ideals may have been expressed largely through the religious language of Puritanism, it had boldly cleared the remains of feudalism and the idle rule of the court aristocracy aside, enabling the new capitalist class to lead the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of a global empire. And to carry through this capitalist bourgeois revolution fully, the old state machine had been completely broken, including by making a public spectacle of the execution of the king. But Trotsky also discusses the revolutionary Chartist movement of the 19th century. That movement, described by Lenin as the world's first broad, truly mass and politically organised proletarian revolutionary movement. Those are the traditions of the British working class that we have to remember. Trotsky also points out how the avowed belief in supposedly only gradual change by Tory leaders like Baldwin had soon been put aside once the gradual emergence of Germany onto the world arena had become big enough for it to become a significant rival to Britain's global dominance. He jokes from 1914 to 1918, Mr. Baldwin categorically rejected the applicability of gradualness to Anglo-German relations and endeavoured to settle the matter by means of vast quantities of high explosive. But more generally, Trotsky points out that a Marxist view of history recognises that periods where the pace of change seems slow and drawn out, perhaps like the one that many socialists have faced in recent years, can, as Trotsky puts it, go hand in hand with catastrophes, breaks, and upward and downward leaps. The long process of competition between two states gradually prepares a war. The discontent of exploited workers gradually prepares a strike, he explains. Trotsky also, very astutely by the way, looks ahead to World War II, analysing how, as he puts it, the development of military technique is reducing the tremendous historical advantages of Britain's island position to zero. America, that gigantic island, walled off on both sides by oceans, remains invulnerable. But Britain's greatest centres of population, and London above all, can face a murderous air attack from the continent of Europe in the course of a few hours. Well, he certainly knew what he was talking about there. The book also discusses, very interestingly, the role that a socialist majority in a British Parliament could play, pointing out that genuine Marxism has absolutely nothing in common with ultra-lefts who refuse to take the opportunities provided by putting forward a socialist programme as election candidates and by using the platform, if successfully won, of, say, Parliament or local council meetings to stand up for working people. However, Trotsky also explains why, without workers' action outside Parliament to overcome the opposition of a capitalist class under threat, no parliamentary vote alone will ever be sufficient to bring about socialist change, and that the bosses will use every means at their disposal to try, as he puts it, to put a brake on the activity of a genuinely Labour government, to paralyse its efforts, intimidate it, introduce a split in its parliamentary majority, and finally to create a financial panic, dislocation of the food supply, lockouts, to terrorise the top layers of the labour organisations and render the proletariat powerless. And he draws attention to the role that fascist groups could play in that. He adds, only an utter fool can fail to understand that. But sadly, those were exactly the lessons of the coup against Allende's government in Chile in 1973. Trotsky puts it like this: if a truly workers' government came to power in Britain, even in an ultra-democratic way, the workers' government would be forced to defeat the resistance of the privileged classes. On the basis of a direct struggle, the trade unions would actively draw closer together, not only in their top layers, but at their bottom layers as well, and would arrive at the necessity of creating local delegate meetings, in other words, councils or soviets of workers' deputies. A truly Labour government would find itself in this way compelled to replace the old state apparatus of the possessing classes and oppose it with these workers' councils. And he adds that it will be from the ranks of the trade unions that the new workers' state will find its public servants, its administrators and managers of democratically nationalised industry run under workers' control and management. And those points surely still ring true today. So in conclusion, are those ideas from 1925 still relevant in 2025? Well, I, as I hope I've pointed out, certainly believe that they are. But let me finish with the key conclusion that Trotsky gives at the end of the first chapter of Where is Britain Going? He says, the contradictions undermining British society will inevitably intensify. We do not intend to predict the exact tempo of this process. But, Trotsky thought, it will be measurable in terms of years, not in decades. But critically he adds, this general prospect requires us to ask above all the question, will a party be built in Britain in time with the strength and links with the masses to be able to draw out at the right moment all the necessary practical conclusions from the sharpening crisis? It is in this question that Great Britain's fate is today contained. And that critical question from 1925 is the critical question for 2025 as well. Can we build a party that is up to the task? If you're interested in doing so, then join with us in the Socialist Party, because that is the job that we've set out to fulfil.